everyone, thanks for coming. This is Ian Waits with the first story, Don't Listen.
Right, good evening everybody, yes. Welcome, and oh good, it's gone quiet, that's lovely. The story I'm going to share with you this evening concerns the composer, Edmund Bannaway. Some of you may well have heard of him, although it wouldn't surprise me if none of you had, because Bannaway and fame were never more than passing acquaintances. But Bannaway was a contemporary of George Frederick Handel, and indeed it's said that he was greatly jealous of the other's success. But Bannaway did have a very brief flirtation with success himself. This was in 1723, at a time when Handel was already well established as composer for the Chapel Royal, and indeed as a director of the recently founded Royal Academy of Music. And at this point, Bannaway caught the eye, or in his instance the ear, of a wealthy aristocrat, and the aristocrat became his patron. And our story really starts as Bannaway is on his way to London to meet his patron. He travels by coach, and he decided to break the journey overnight at a country inn, an establishment not much different from this. The name of the place doesn't matter, and if you want to think of it as the staff of life, by all means do. But it was a place with wooden ceiling, with an open fire, so it's a familiar setting. Now, as Bannaway travelled on the coach, he was obviously very excited. This was his big chance. He saw this as his opportunity finally to get the recognition that he felt his talent deserved. And as he travelled through the beautiful British countryside in the summer, he felt inspired by the landscape that unfolded around him. And a piece of music began to form in his mind. And as he whiled away the time in the coach, that piece of music took form, and he knew this was something special. He knew this was going to be better than anything he'd ever composed before. He knew that this was the piece that could make his name. When he arrived at the inn, he ate heartily of a meal of mutton pie and drank some ale, but he didn't linger. He didn't stay in the common room because he was too anxious to get back to his room. And once he was in that room, he sat at the small writing desk and he began to write, to put down on paper the score of this wonderful piece of music that had come to him during the journey. And as he wrote, he was overcome by a sense of well-being, of delight. The writing flowed through him. It came from his soul. It flowed through his body, through his arm, through his stylus and onto the parchment in a way that he'd never ever known before. And he knew that this was something fantastic. He totally lost track of all time. He just wrote long into the night, and eventually in the small hours of the morning it was complete. It would need refining, there was orchestration and things to be done, but the piece of music was there on the desk, and he went to bed absolutely exhausted but elated. Because he was so exhausted he couldn't comment on how good or firm or otherwise the bed was. He fell asleep very quickly, fell into a deep, deep sleep, but he woke in the morning and the same zeal, the same excitement was still there. And of course the first thing he wanted to do was to review what he'd written the night before. So he got straight up, went to the desk, but it was empty. This masterpiece, the piece of music that was going to make his name, had disappeared. He was, needless to say, distraught, furious. A whole welter of emotions went through him. He searched the room, he ransacked the place, but could find no sign of it. He woke up the landlord and his wife, everyone in the inn who wasn't yet awake. He got them involved. Everybody had a search, but still the precious score failed to materialise. The landlord, who had a certain suspicion of one of his staff, sacked the chambermaid because he felt that this was almost certainly the person who had taken the piece of music, but still to no avail. It didn't appear. And eventually, reluctantly, still furious, still in turmoil, Bannaway realised that he would have to continue his journey into London without his precious piece of music. When he got to London, the first thing he tried to do was to try to recreate it, to write it again. But whatever muse had been with him on the first part of the journey failed to continue after the inn. And what he wrote was a pale shadow of the piece of music he'd written that night. Sad to say that Bannaway's life from there went into decline. The patronage that he'd earned with the aristocrat, it didn't really work out. It was terminated early because all he could do was try to recreate this wonderful piece of music. And he never really produced anything that satisfied either him or his patron. It became an obsession. It drove him mad, and I'm sorry to say he ended his life in a mental institution in a very dark and dire place. So we'll draw a veil over Bannaway for the moment. you may wonder what actually happened to that precious score, the thing that he'd centred his life on and which failed him. Well, the truth is that nobody really knows. It was never discovered, but the belief is that the music never left the inn. And there are two schools of thought for this. Some people believe that the chambermaid had indeed stolen it, that for whatever reason she'd hidden it somewhere within the inn with the intention of claiming it later, but because she was dismissed, never got the opportunity. So that piece of music, hidden somewhere within the structure of the inn, rotted away. Some believe that it may have been a twist of fate, that somehow it was certainly a warm evening, that Banaway had perhaps slept with a window open and a draught had lifted the manuscript off the desk, that somehow it had fallen down a crack in the floorboards and never been discovered. We don't know. But there is strong evidence to believe the theory that perhaps that piece of music never actually left the inn. And I say that because forever afterwards, for years afterwards, for centuries afterwards, people would claim to just hear a snatch of music just at the edge of their perception, something that caught them, that tantalised them. And a prime example of this is the case of Mary Weaver. Now, I don't know, anyone locally may have heard of Mary Weaver, but Mary Weaver was hanged more than 100 years after Banaway had his fateful stay at the inn. She was hanged for murder. And the lady she murdered was one Lizzie? Try Lizzie. Was one Lizzie Wheeler. The two girls were said to be firm friends, and both actually worked at the inn where Banaway had stayed. This was 1845, so say more than a century later. Lizzie Wheeler was a barmaid, Mary Weaver was a chambermaid at the hotel, and both girls claimed that at different times they'd heard these snatches of music, and they became so entranced with this music that both would hum the tune while they were working. The problem was that they'd only heard snatches, and both would hum different tunes that, while clearly related, were their own interpretation of what they'd heard. And at first this was a cause of much merriment and banter between them, but as time went on, each became more and more adamant that the tune they were humming was the right one and that the other girl was wrong. And gradually this became more and more heated and acrimonious, until the situation came about where the two of them ended up in a row, and I'm afraid to say that poor Mary, in front of the landlord, in front of everyone, very deliberately and very forcefully pushed Lizzie Wheeler down the stairs. Lizzie landed hard, broke her neck and never moved again. And as I say, as a result, Mary was executed. Now, a more modern indication that this music has never departed the inn happened less than 50 years ago in the 1960s. And this relates to the group Jerry, Paul and the Jesters. I don't know whether anyone remembers. I see one of two of you may well recall them, and I bet if you do remember them, that right now, running through your minds, is the tune to Love Leads Me On, their classic hit, which was a number 2 hit in 1965, kept off the top only by the Beatles' help. And for a while, Jerry, Paul and the Jesters enjoyed a huge amount of success. They were very, very popular. They were mobbed in the streets. But it was a success they never ever repeated. And sad to say that less than 2 years after their record was sitting at number 2 in the charts, Jerry Paul was found dead in his hotel room from a heroin overdose. Now, what you might not know, and what's less well known, is that that tune, that classic tune, Love Leads Me On, which they'd hoped was going to be the opening to fame and fortune, it was actually written in this pub. Jerry wrote it one evening, sitting here, almost in one take. The tune came to him completely, most of the lyrics were there. It wasn't quite completed, some lyrics would need adding, but the song, in essence, was written in one take, sitting in the pub. And the problem was, and according to Jerry's biographer, that by the time he died, he'd come to hate that song, to absolutely detest that song. The reason being because it wasn't right. The tune that he'd put into the song wasn't quite the tune that had taunted him, that he'd heard in the pub, and he spent the rest of his life trying to correct it and get it right. It drove him to distraction. In trying to get there, he started dabbling with drugs to expand his mind, to try and get a more perfect recall of the time when he'd been in the pub and the tune had come to him. And it had the tragic consequences. Now, there are other examples through the years that I could tell you about, but they're less dramatic and so less well detailed because they're less of less interest to those who record the events of history. And there are others to speak, and so I won't take up too much more of your time. I just want to leave you with one thing, and it's a request really. If this evening, whilst you're enjoying the stories, whilst you're having a drink, if when you get up and you hear a chair creak, you hear a door creak, even the sound of a beer being poured from a hand pump as a pint's pulled, or if the wind whispers to you as you step outside tonight and you think that in there somewhere you can just hear a hint of a tune, a hint of music, please don't listen. I know that human nature is to hang on to these things and to try and expand them and try and develop them, but resist that temptation. For the sake of your own sanity and for the sake of those who love you, please don't listen. Thank you.